Father Arnold, a parish priest. When I talked to Father Arnold many years ago, he was in his mid-60s. He struck me as a man who knows how to get things done, a very competent parish priest. Father Arnold's background.
I was born a Catholic and in a typical Irish Catholic family. I spent 25 years as a professor, college professor, and I was a biologist, but I taught essentially in the college seminary. This is a place just for young men who wish to be priests. I left teaching mostly because I was living in a dorm, and the original rules, of course, were that 10 o'clock at night the lights went out. But I had the switch in my room. You pull the big switch, and the students' lights went out, so they had to go to bed. And so the place was quiet.
That's a good idea.
Yeah. Then as time went on, and they changed the rules, and the students agitated for different ways and so forth, they were allowed to stay up. And you know, the night that I got my son buzzed me at 2 o'clock in the morning, buzzed my doorbell, and offered me a piece of pizza. I was very gracious, and I said, "Gee, thanks for thinking of me." And my way back to my bed, I said, "I'm out of here." And I can't take this any longer. So my original love was always this parish life, for working with people, and with the variety of the experience of a parish priest, rather than the routine of an academic. And so I decided I would return to this kind of a life.
Celibacy.
When I was a kid, I started off as Catholic. And the priesthood appealed to me, except for the fact that you couldn't get married.
Yeah,
so was that ever a big factor for you?
Not really. Not really. Put it this way, you went to the seminary when you were 16. In those days, you were not very sexually conscious, you know. It was a different era, different time, and you were still quite naive at this point. And they would spend the 4 years of the college not propagandizing, but just bringing you up to, this is what it's going to be. Is this what you want? So you had a lot of support in making a decision, and I never felt that that it was a threat to me or anything. And I would have liked to have had a family. I go crazy over kids, but I can send them home. So I get the best part of it. But the loneliness part, you have to experience it to really, I think, understand. To me, it was never the sexual part, in the sense I'd like to have had a warm wife in my bed, but I could say survive without that. But the idea of being all by myself, and that's part of the charism of celibacy, is what you're doing is you're showing the world that you can survive with God as your only support. That's theoretically what it's about. That's great theoretically, but in practice it can get very lonely.
How priests' lives have changed.
The worst things are not the worst things I anticipated, in the sense the church changed so radically. And now, for example, just from the point of view, let's say, of staffing of the churches, of the parishes, when I was ordained a priest, the staffing was such that you were an associate pastor, in those days curate, for 27 years, until your seniority button was pushed and you became a pastor, all right? And at that point, you were made a pastor of a small parish, out in the suburbs or something, usually by yourself. After 4 or 5 years of that, you'll be made a pastor of a parish with 2 or 3 priests, or eventually perhaps a parish of 3 or 4 priests were there. And so what you envisioned as a young priest was, when you were in your 60s and so forth, you would be the pastor of a large parish. Your income would be pretty good. So you wouldn't really have any financial worries. But the main thing was you were the boss, and you could tell 4 priests what to do. And you could, maybe you might be 70 years old or 68 or something, but you gave them their orders for the week, and you were not technically retired, but your time was pretty much your own, you know. And that's what you envisioned. That's the way the thing would end. You'd end up dying in your rectory, and with great pomp and ceremony you'd be buried from your own church. Well, that whole thing has reversed itself. Here I am, I'm 66 years old, I'm all by myself. And what happens now is the big parishes are those that are in the worst trouble. They're in the inner city parishes and so forth. They have the toughest financial situations usually, and they have the crises of all kinds, and they have the people problems of a real serious nature. So you need a young man to survive it. So the young men are being made pastors of the bigger churches. But now as you get older, you end up in a smaller place. It's just the opposite. And the people have got to learn. That's one of the frustrating things about it. The people are so used to, seeing 3 and 4 priests in a place. They still think they can call them at midnight and have a priest who's responsible to answer the phone, you know. And that was the case 25 years ago, you know. And so the other priests could pull their phones out of the wall, but I'm the only priest here. I had a woman a couple of years ago who called me at 3 o'clock in the morning and wanted me to get her a mass card. And I said, "Are you coming for it now?" "Oh, I'll come in the morning." I said, "Well, why are you calling me at this hour?" And she said, "Well, what time is it?" I said, "It's 3 o'clock in the morning." "Oh, I don't sleep very well." I said, "Well, I do." And I hung up on her, you know. And she showed up in the morning and not a blink of an eye, and and so forth. And well, why she had called me in the first place, that's of course an extreme. But people think nothing of calling you at 7 o'clock in the morning or midnight. I got to talk to you for a minute, you know.
Yeah. But see, I appreciate the time you're spending with me, right?
Yeah.
There's one thing I read that because there are somewhat less priests, those priests are having more and more to do, actually.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I'm doing much more now than I did 20 years ago, right?
Yeah.
And you understand why the people don't see this, but if you try to educate them to it, and you say, give me a break, you look at that bulletin that says, these are my office hours, try to call. If you get to call all the time, it's fine, but at least try to call during the office hours, and not in the middle of my supper, I don't think I had a meal in 20 years when someone has interrupted me.
No kidding, no, jeez.
Yeah, and, well, at some time I can be sure to get you, that sort of stuff,
Yeah, I work with, I used to work with mentally ill people, now I work with retarded people. There are times when you feel like every time you turn around, somebody say, "Fix my problem, fix my problem."
Right,
you get tired of that after a while.
Right, yeah.
Sometimes you'd like to hang around with some people who are not needy,
right,
but who are giving and fun to be with.
Right, yeah.
It can be wearing.
Yeah.
Catholicism and evolution.
But the main thing was that the Catholic Church has never condemned evolution. The Church that condemned evolution was the Episcopal Church. Because Darwin was Episcopalian. Darwin was Episcopalian minister. And the Catholic Church has never condemned evolution. When I was teaching, there was a new textbook, a biology textbook, college textbook, that was published by a professor over at Harvard. Excellent, really excellent. But in the very early chapters, he had a chapter on the history of science, of biology. And there was a statement in the text saying that the theory of evolution was condemned by the Roman Catholic Church, okay? So I wrote the guy a letter. And I said, I really want to use your textbook, but you've got an egregious error in it that's non-factual. Can you demonstrate to me or document the fact that the Roman Catholic Church has condemned evolution? And he wrote back and he said, your letter shocked me. He said, I've always assumed that. He said, I've never looked it up. He said, and I went to to the resources. He said, and I find you're correct, Father. He said, the Roman Catholic Church has never condemned evolution. Then he said to me, would you like to write an edition of my book with me that could be usable in, let's say, a Catholic college? And I wrote back and said, listen, I said, there's no such thing as Catholic science. You know, there's Catholic theology, but no Catholic science. You do your science, and as long as it's accurate, the church isn't going to condemn you, or is not going to challenge you or anything. The church has to work with what you say, and will. But then I'm going to use your textbook. I'm just going to have the kids cross out that one sentence. And the next time that book was re-edited, it was out of it.
Birth control.
Yeah, no, as I say, I don't challenge the church. I don't even challenge the church in birth control. You know, I was a biologist. I believe that when Humanae Vitae was published, for example, when it was announced it was going to be published, and a lot of the seminarians I had in class at the time, they were all excited, and there was this lay commission had been appointed, and they were all going to vote in favor of birth control. And that was a big thing with young priests. I was a young priest in those days, you know. You'd be in agony on Saturday night in the confessional with these young couples who were good people, and they had 3 and 4 kids, you know, and they'd be in agony with their consciences about this, you know. And we were all for it in the sense that just to get them people off our backs, you know, and make it easier for us, you know. We were delighted to have people who do this, and maybe it's had to have the church say it was okay, but I knew it wasn't going to happen. I said to my students, I said, it's not going to happen. I said, the committee might vote, but the Pope will never approve. I said, he can't. He's in a box with the doctrines of the church. I said, but I said, his main concern is going to be that to allow birth control is going to be the first step to abortion. And that'll be the next thing will be attacked. So he can't do it. And but I explained to him my view was that he was talking on a level of, let's say, the well-being of the human race, okay? He was not talking on the level of a young couple in Charlestown, Massachusetts or something or other, with 5 kids around the table. You know, he was not saying, you're going to hell if you do this, you know? So you work with that.
The Church teaches that artificial birth control is a serious sin. It does not teach that it is a serious sin except, or unless, or in the following situations. It teaches that, quote, every action which proposes to render procreation impossible is intrinsically evil, unquote. Nor does the Church teach that artificial birth control is bad for the human race as a whole, but not necessarily for the individual case. Time and time again, I see priests rationalizing their way around bad teachings.
I had a cousin who had 7 children. And the last 2 she had after she was told she had breast cancer and was to have no more children. But the day she died, I was sitting beside her bed with all these babies on the bed, enough to tear your heart out. And I'm holding her hand, and she said to me, if I go to heaven and find out birth control is all right, I'm going to walk out. It isn't fair, you know. But she felt the church told her, and you know, God help us in those days, you get someone to come in and say, Father, you know, I've got breast cancer. Can I do something? You know, my kids need me. And today, we have no problem with that in the sense that we say, you know, okay, you know, do your thing. You know, do what you think God wants you to do, what your responsibilities are in this world, and so forth. And is it the worst thing in the world? You know? To me, a couple of 4 or 5 kids who practice birth control certainly are not in the same condition as and it's people who sell drugs or something or other to kids.
Yeah. Well, see, that's one of the problems I've had with Catholicism is that these things were put on the same.
Yeah, they were. No question about it. Question about it. And I think that. But was that the official teaching of the church, or was that the sort of the voice of the times?
The church divinely guided.
If you look at the history of the papacy, for example, and you see that certain popes were elected when they were 10 years of age and so forth, and some of them at the age of 22 announced, I never wanted to be pope, I never wanted to be a priest or a bishop or anything, and you kind of taken my life away from me, and I'm going to take a woman. And this was done. Some of them, they had their mistresses and everything else, but it's amazing that none of them that were, let's say, the bad popes, ever made a theological statement that was incorrect or inconsistent with the teaching of the church. So you had your consistency. There aren't really any cases. There are cases of the applications of doctrine that were disastrous, as the Inquisition, if you wish, and so forth.
Father Arnold views the Inquisition as the result of a bad application of a principle rather than the result of a bad principle. In other words, the principle of upholding correct religious beliefs is valid, but torturing people to make them agree to those beliefs is not valid. However, the New Catholic Encyclopedia says, in 1252, Innocent IV sanctioned the affliction of torture by the civil authorities upon heretics. That is a policy and principle in and of itself, not just the misapplication of another principle. When people are burned at the stake, that is not merely an incorrect application of justice, that is injustice itself. Regarding the concept of papal infallibility, priests play an intellectual shell game. The teaching is, when the Roman pontiff defines a doctrine concerning faith or morals to be held by the whole church, he teaches infallibly. And Christ endowed the church's shepherds with the charism of infallibility in matters of faith and morals. But you'll find that any time it becomes obvious the church is wrong in a matter of morals, such as sanctioning torture against heretics, then they pretend it wasn't really church policy, that it was just an ancillary problem, that it didn't really come from the Pope, that it was just a few misguided people in the church, and so on, instead of admitting the Pope was wrong in a serious matter of morals. Here's another deceptive intellectual ploy. They claim that infallibility doesn't mean the church is never wrong. It means the church is divinely guided in its support of eternal, essential Catholic doctrine. But if you limit the arena of infallibility to just doctrine, you're essentially just making a tautological assertion that the church is infallible because it has always supported Catholicism. In other words, Catholic religious doctrine is the truth, the church has always supported Catholic religious doctrine, so therefore the church is infallible. Well, so what? This kind of infallibility is of very little value, like upholding the doctrine of the Trinity, or the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, and so on. The point is this: the Church does not teach that it is divinely guided in matters of doctrine only. It teaches that it is also divinely guided in matters of morals, and that claim is refuted by church history. You can't be burning people at the stake as a policy and then still say you are divinely guided in matters of morals. You can't do that and still be considered a valid belief system. Where does ultimate authority lie? In the church or in your conscience?
Yeah. So it's no longer this is right, this is wrong, this is right, this is wrong. It's more this is the principle that we're trying to uphold.
Right.
But everything considered, you may have to go your own conscience here.
Yeah, and that's in the New Catechism, for example, it makes it very, very clear that the first standard of truth and behavior is the personal, individual conscience. That's always been the teaching of the Church.
Oh, that statement needs closer examination. The Church does teach the right to follow your conscience. The right to the exercise of freedom, especially in moral and religious matters, is an inalienable requirement of the dignity of the human person. Okay, but priests obscure the matter by going one step further and concluding you can be right in following your conscience contrary to a church teaching. But the correct conclusion is only that you have the right to make a wrong choice, not that you can be right in making a choice contrary to church teaching. There cannot be two ultimate authorities, your conscience and the church. It has to be one or the other. And I say, according to the Bible, according to Jesus, it has to be the church. In Matthew 16:19, Jesus gives the keys to the kingdom to Peter, not to people and their consciences. In Matthew 18:18, he says, what Peter and the apostles bind and loose will be bound and loosed, not what the people and their consciences bind and loose. In Catholic theology, the only proper claim about your conscience versus church teaching is that you are free to follow your conscience and be wrong. You are free to choose sin. And Father Arnold's claim that personal individual conscience is the, quote, first standard of truth is specious. The Church, for example, does not teach that abortion can be okay if a person's conscience says it's okay. I think Catholics are a prime example of people continually living with cognitive dissonance, believing two mutually exclusive claims are both true at the same time.
Now, a lot of my contemporaries talk about the fact that the Church offers us guidelines today, not rules, okay? They would prefer the rules. And a lot of my contemporaries are unhappy and uneasy about even their priesthood because we were taught to go by the rules. Mm-hmm. And now they feel abandoned almost by the Church. You know, that there is so much more flexibility. The priests of 30 years ago could stand behind, in front of, let's say, the Church and say to people, but the Church says this. This is what you ought to do. All right? And that's all he had to say. You know, he didn't have to listen to their personal reasons. He didn't have to agonize with them. You know, and that's where a lot of, let's say, my contemporaries are in a sense angry or upset because they've had to get much more emotionally involved people than they ever planned to. Mm-hmm. And we weren't trained to get emotionally involved with people. Mm-hmm. We were trained to remain aloof. We were the ones that would say, mm-hmm. this is it. Mm-hmm. God says do this, you know. Mm-hmm. And that's the way we were trained. And obviously this other approach is much better, but we weren't trained for that, and it has been difficult. Mm-hmm. And so you still get a lot of priests who say, no, if you're practicing birth control, you're in serious sin, and that's it, you know, and go away, you know, and that sort of thing. Because it's the, I wouldn't say the easier way out, but it's where they are. They can't bring themselves to say, well, let's sit down, you know, this is what the Church teaches, but how are we going to work with this in your life? They're threatened by that.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's why I left the Church, was because I felt those are the rules, and if I don't accept them, then I can't be. Then I'm not going to be a Catholic. Yeah. Because it seemed pretty definite to me.
I find religious people in general, in order to maintain their belief system, are very prone to accepting isolated pieces of logic and to ignoring broader common sense. It reminds me of something I read years ago in Mad magazine. The mob's lawyers insisted the victim died of natural causes, because what could be more natural than to die with a bullet in your head? I think that's pretty funny. But that's what I find religious people do. They use logic in very biased, self-serving ways. Father Wayne, parish priest. Is today's church progressive or conservative?
I feel like I said this to a couple of bishops, I feel like a Democrat working in a Republican administration.
Yeah. Well, my impression was that you're more towards the liberal side.
Yeah, I'd like to say moderate. Because, you know, if the cardinal or the pope said to me, cool it, I would cool it. But I try to keep my sermons moderate because I think it would scandalize the people who are very conservative and not too well educated as adults. It would shock them too much, you know, to give them a liberal Catholic dose all at once. They'd have a reaction to that. There were 40 of us ordained in 1955, and maybe 15 have died. Well, maybe 8 have died and 8 have gotten married. So there are 25 of us still working, and half of them are nostalgic for the old church, and others are glad it's gone.
But they're nostalgic for forms of worship?
Yeah.
The ones
I think they're nostalgic for the crowds of people who used to come to Mass, the large groups of obedient school children who used to attend religious classes, the people who used to come to church on Sunday afternoon for Vespers. They would come during the week for a mission or a retreat and pack the church for a whole
so there's a lot more
for a whole week. And you know, those good old days are gone because there are lots of other distractions for people, interests and things that lure them in other directions. The machinery at the Vatican is still Italian, and the Italian bishops and cardinals who run the front, the head office, are Italians. It's still a very Italian church, and they drag their feet a lot about, you know, implementing Vatican II. I was over in Italy for a sabbatical. I was there from maybe August through December in '89, and you could just sense that it was a very reactionary Italian religion that you were dealing with all over Italy. When I left home to go, I got on the Irish Airlines plane to go to Ireland, and an Irish priest sat down beside me. He didn't know I was a priest. I had old clothes on, but I told him shortly. But then he launched into you know, anti-Vatican II tirade that took us all the way to Shannon Airport. And you know, from Logan Airport on, I was back in the old church again. Nearly everybody I ran into was an old church person. Until I got to North American College, and it was like being back here when I went through the gates into the American College that's at the Vatican. You know, the food was American, and the talk was American, and the young priests were progressive. But everywhere else it hasn't moved, hasn't budged an inch.
People who claim they are Catholic.
That's one of the church's big problems still, that ex-Catholics don't very often declare themselves. You know, they'll be lapsed Catholics, but if you ever try to insinuate that they're not Catholics, they'll punch your face in. And there are loads of those around. You know, 2 out of 3 Catholics in our community don't go to church at all. They never go near the church. You know. But, you know, when the U.S. Census man goes door to door and asks what their religion is, they'll say Catholic.
Abortion not allowed for a rape victim.
If a woman is raped and gets pregnant, she's not allowed to have an abortion, is that correct?
That's right. As a Christian moral doctrine, that's what we hold. Because, you know, a new human person has been conceived and is alive and has rights to live. And so you can't snuff it out. Can't snuff him out or her out. It's not an it in favor of the other person. You know, as soon as he's conceived, he has a right to be encouraged all the way through the 9 months to be born.
But human beings do have the right to take a life in certain cases, though.
Yeah.
Like in self-defense.
Yeah.
So, to me, that life should be taken because it was the result of an act of violence.
Oh, yeah.
So to me, it's almost like validating that act of violence and hatred.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine. It's almost I can't imagine a woman wanting to have a child that was produced from a rape.
She probably wouldn't. And she'd be stuck with him. But no, the church still insists that as soon as the new human being is conceived, he has a right to live.
That to me is like a very lofty value.
Yes.
It really puts a very high value.
It's an ideal.
Yeah, a very high ideal.
Yeah.
But then when I look at the popes you mentioned and the Inquisition and all that, I just, whoa. It's
Yeah.
like, what, there's holding these ideals,
Yeah.
and yet, what is the actual practice? There's a guy named Frank Zappa. You know Frank Zappa?
I do,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I think he died, but I remember reading a book, Catholic book.
The Mothers of Invention.
All right. He said when the practice does not live up to the rhetoric, then after a while you have to question the rhetoric.
Yeah.
And you know, if the church was spotless and everything seemed to be so good and right, then I might consider, well, maybe the church is right about this. But you know, in the meantime, I just see this as misguided. I think we do have the right to end a potential life that was started with an act of hatred and violence. That's my opinion.
You know, I don't know whether your basic argument that and Frank Zappa's basic argument that when the practice gets so far away from the ideal, there's something wrong with the institution whose practice is not ideal. I think the ideal still stands there, and we should be ashamed that we're so far away from it.
I agree that people or an institution falling short of an ideal doesn't necessarily invalidate that ideal. But I think many of the church's ideals are intrinsically invalid because they are more legalistic than they are humane. Utopian ideals can stand in the way of what is reasonable and good for us. The demand for perfection can be the enemy of the good. Masturbation and mortal sin.
Speaking of murder, if masturbation is a mortal sin, just like murder is a mortal sin, that was one thing I couldn't accept, that masturbation was such a grievous sin that you deserve to go to hell.
Yeah.
In the same category as murder. And I don't know the exact statistics, but I would figure that most people have masturbated in their lives. So that, I mean, pretty much everybody is a rotten person and belongs in hell. So that was one of the major issues that just didn't make sense to me.
Yeah. Well, murder and masturbation and missing Mass on Sunday, they were all identified as mortal sins.
Is that still true on missing Mass too? Is that
Yeah.
still?
Yeah. And that would be something that was studied and deliberately done and fully consented to. You know, there was sufficient study of the circumstances, the right and wrong of the situation, and then it was done with full deliberation and then and complete consent of the will. And that's the old definition of mortal sin, and that's the new definition of mortal sin, call it sin. And
but mortal sin includes the penalty of hell, right?
yeah, well, the penalty of hell is being cut off from God, which we have just done by sinning. You know, we've turned our back deliberately, with full consent, complete knowledge of what we're doing, and in a serious matter. I should have added that too, in a serious matter. And we've done that, and so we have put ourselves in hell.
I find Christians like to refer to hell as turning our backs on God, and they consistently ignore the real issue at hand: the severity of the punishment, the utter cruelty of making a sentient being suffer brutally forever. That is not a loving God.
Latin countries never took the Friday abstinence thing seriously.
Yeah, but doesn't that show whether you're eating fish or not eating, or eating meat or not eating meat on a Friday? One group of people it's okay, another it isn't. Something so trivial and debatable that could be the factor that sends you to hell. I don't know. That doesn't compute for me. I don't know if we did. Did we resolve masturbation?
Question number 3. No, we didn't.
Let me ask you this question: as a priest in confession, I would imagine that comes up an awful lot, especially with high school boys, I would guess.
Yeah, it does, and it's always veiled in general words that I was impure with myself, or 3 sins of impurity, or something like that. Mm. But usually there are circumstances that lessen the seriousness of it. It can waste time, and it can be used as a means to focus on bad thoughts and take you further away from God. And those are the bad things about it. Sometimes nervousness that won't let you sleep.
But if it's considered a mortal sin enough to send you to hell, if you compare it to murder and you say, well, this murder is a little bit the person is not quite so guilty because he was anxious and because he had trouble sleeping and because he was immature or whatever reasons you give.
Yeah.
Really, if a person commits a murder, that's no excuse.
But I go back to the definition of a mortal sin. The definition has to be referred to that, this is a serious matter objectively, that it's been fully considered, and you're going to go ahead and do it anyway. Biting your fingernails, your mother might say, "Don't do that, Junior, that's a mortal sin." But you know that's not a serious matter, so that rules it out.
Well, see, that's the way I look at masturbation. It's not a serious matter in terms of hurting anybody. What is? I talked with a priest years ago about what is the reason why
Yeah.
And he said that it was because it goes against God's purpose, because the purpose of that was for procreation.
Yeah.
And you're taking it out of that context, and therefore it's a sin against God.
The loss of the seed.
Well, sure, but you've got plenty more.
But you know, the question we're asking is masturbation a serious matter? And Church says yes, it is.
But for me, you gave me a definitive answer there, sort of. But for me, it's like the same people that carried on the Inquisition are now advising me about sexual matters, and I don't know. It's like, I think Phil Donahue used the expression, a bunch of old men sitting on hard benches in Rome are telling us what to do with our personal lives.
Yeah.
So that's the way I feel.
Yeah.
Galileo.
How can the church be divinely guided if it rejects Galileo and what he said, when Galileo was speaking the truth?
Yeah. Well, it's true that at the University of Pisa, Galileo invited the church leaders to come in and look through his telescope and see proof that he was right, and they wouldn't look. You know, we've got a whole 2,000-year history behind us of mistakes like that.
Yeah.
And
yet you still feel the church is divinely guided, despite all those mistakes.
Problem with Galileo was that he would promise not to publicize his new discoveries, and then he'd turn right around and do it. And so it was a disciplinary thing. And he said, okay, I won't write this book. I'll wait until you give me permission. And he'd go away and he'd start lecturing on it and writing things and distributing literature on his new ideas. So they'd arrest him again and bring him in. And
yeah, but even if he was a murderer, it's the church that's on trial here, not him. I mean, because
the church made lots of mistakes along the way.
Well, that's the type of mistake, because to me that wasn't just a scientific matter, that was something a Bible-based issue of faith that the church was standing up for, and it was wrong.
Who has the power to forgive sins? God only, or priests also?
Who has the power to forgive sins? Is it God or is it priests?
It's God.
It's God. Then the Bible says Jesus gives the apostles power to forgive sins. So he's giving them the power to forgive sins.
Yeah, he's giving them his power. He's handing on the power to forgive from God to him to the apostles.
So now man has the power to forgive sins.
I don't look at it that way. You know, at the absolution, at the end of confession, the priest says, I absolve you from all your sins in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. And I always interpret that as meaning, in the name of God, I absolve you from all your sins. I wash away all your sins in the name of the Father. In the name of God, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, I wash away all of your sins. And the only thing that I am there to determine is that this person is truly repentant.
But you can't know that. As a
No.
man, you can't know for sure.
No.
So you can't have the power to...
No, I throw that problem back to God when I give absolution, you know. If he doesn't forgive, then it's not forgiven.
All right, so if somebody's not really sorry, but they pretend to be sorry, and you give them absolution,
Yeah.
it doesn't take effect because God knows he wasn't really sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, but then you don't have the power to forgive sin.
No, I don't. I said that in the first place. I don't.
Okay, but then you're contradicting what Jesus said. Because he said, I'm giving you the power to forgive sins.
Yeah.
Which to me is that
He said, whose sins you have forgiven, they are...
Yeah, what you bind on earth,
they are forgiven.
Yeah. That to me is
Yeah.
a very, I don't want to say typical, but a very critical part of religions is that they give man divine sanction for what they're doing, and that's a key mistake. I mean, David Koresh was not God, and he didn't have the right to do the things he did. And I see the same thing right there. When Jesus says that, that's somebody writing down the gospel, saying, you know, giving ourselves power because we want. I see it as a control thing.
You know, I think God is there, and I'm there as official representative of the church, the community of people. And this person comes to confession to be reconciled to God and to his community. And I'm the official representative of the community who accepts his repentance and welcomes him back into the people of God. But it is God who is still there with us, who is doing the forgiving, the divine forgiving. I don't think that Jesus turned forgiveness over to the apostles.
You're interpreting as, in a common sense fashion, something that's rational, but disregarding what it actually says in the Bible. I think it's abundantly clear in the Bible that power is given to human beings to forgive sins, and I don't. It's not stated the way you described it.
But I think the only important thing in the sacrament of penance or reconciliation is that God forgives. As a matter of fact, he has forgiven already. You know, if you immediately after your sin regret it completely and say an act of contrition.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. I agree with you absolutely. I think that's the way it is. As soon as you are sorry, God forgives you, and therefore going to a priest is sort of like maybe some therapy or something. But I don't know.
Well, going to a priest is asking for reconciliation with the community. A lot of the people who come to confession are already forgiven by God, and they make a deliberate move to come to church and do this ritual thing to sort of put the cap on that forgiveness of God.
Yeah, Jesus didn't say, I give you the power to sort of put the cap on it.
Matthew 18:18 says, "Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." John 20:23 says, "Whose sins you forgive are forgiven them, and whose sins you retain are retained." These passages don't say it is God who actually forgives, not you. You only sort of put a cap on it. These passages say unambiguously that human beings have the power to forgive sins. They say pointedly that it is the apostles' decisions that count. There is no mention of this power being ceremonial or provisional upon God's approval. Now, certainly there are many kinds of power can be legitimately delegated, but not the power to forgive sins, because only God can truly know if a person is sincerely sorry. And therefore, the power to forgive cannot be delegated without the attendant power of knowing a person's soul, a power mere men do not have. In my opinion, priests, fallible human beings, having the power to forgive sins, the personal sins of others, is an utterly bogus spiritual concept. It is born of man's desire to establish power, control, and status for themselves. I think paragraph 1441 of the New Catechism of the Catholic Church is a classic example of this unprincipled practice of religions of constantly presenting mutually exclusive ideas as both true. The first sentence of that paragraph says, "Only God forgives sins." The last sentence of the very same paragraph says, "He gives this power to men to exercise in His name." If only God forgives sins, then men cannot also have the power to forgive sins. If men have the power to forgive sins, then it is not only God who forgives sins. You can say God is the source of forgiveness, but you cannot say only God forgives sins and so does man. Father Wayne hosted a series of talks entitled Everything You Wanted to Know About the Catholic Church But Were Afraid to Ask. I attended several of these sessions, and the small group of participants didn't mind my taping during the last session. Liberal Catholicism and Women Priests.
I think you could turn the tape recorder off at this point, but never mind. I think as far as women priests go, for example, there will be a day, and not too far into the future, maybe another generation or two, and we will see women priests. When the system of having rectories with several priests in them, or monasteries with a whole bunch of priests, all male, when that era passes and there's just one priest in town who lives in a little cottage somewhere in the community and maybe teaches in the public high school and works weekends at the local church. I think when we come to that, there's no reason why, there's no theological reason why it couldn't be a woman instead of a man who presided at the Eucharist. And there are some of the renegade sisters and laywomen now who will all gather together at a convention and celebrate the Eucharist. But at this point we would say that's invalid, you know. It's a nice religious ceremony, but it's invalid. You know, the directive has come out from Rome to not even discuss it anymore. But all I say is that I don't see any reason why it won't happen. Whether we discuss it or not, it's going to happen.
Birth control.
And we should work at the other end with a serious birth control.
Really, I agree. Just financially. I mean, you know, these young people getting married, they don't practice birth control. How are they going to live with, you know, a kid every year? Like we had 5 children, you know, a few years back.
Yeah.
But I can remember when our 5th one was born, and that was, I mean, you know, enough. You know what I mean? I remember someone told us to go to the Carmelites down the North Shore Shopping Center. They're very lenient, and they'll okay birth control. Real honest.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, your own parish priest wouldn't condone that. You know, no, you can't. You know, you have to go by the laws. But you go a few miles down the road, you know, the North Shore Shopping Center, and we went there, and the priest said, "Listen, you've got 5 children. You know, birth prevention is in the eyes of God. God would say yes. You know." So, you know, it's very confusing. You know, it's always been confusing issues like that.
Hardly anybody confesses birth control as a sin now. Hardly ever. They've reconciled that.
In my view, Catholics have not reconciled it in any legitimate way. They've just decided to ignore the issue. The catch-22 of being taught not to question and then later being criticized for simplistic understandings.
I really, it disturbs me to hear people say, but we were always taught. That makes reference to childhood, usually. There are so many Catholics who have never had a bit of education beyond the day that they were confirmed, or beyond the day that they ended Sunday school and were not confirmed. And they keep relying on that and going back to it as if it were a proper education to function with as adults. It's like somebody going down to Cape Canaveral and applying at NASA for a job as a space scientist and showing them your resume from grade 7 and grade 8 where you took general science, you know, and those are your credentials. And we don't do that in any other area of life except religion. We Catholics especially, we point back to the childhood education that we received and imply that that's good enough to function with, operate with as a human being as an adult, and that's not true at all.
So I guess what bothered me when you said that the other day was that you said it sort of betrays their passivity, that they were being sheep-like.
Yeah.
But my experience has been that kind of attitude is what's taught, that it's kind of small-minded to question, and that it is great-minded to believe. And the less the evidence, and the more you believe, the greater mind, the more spiritual and wonderful you are. In fact, Jesus says that himself with Thomas.
Yeah.
You've seen me and believe, but blessed are those who believe me but haven't seen me. So it was very much emphasized to believe and not to question. And it's also my experience that people are encouraged to question a little bit. But as soon as they go past the little line, then they get really turned on by priests and others. That now you're being really unreasonable, nasty, and a bad person because you're taking your questioning a little further than we like. So I think the whole thing's like a catch-22. You know, you're told to have faith, believe, trust, and then later on when you question, well, gee, but you told us, and well, that's what was taught. You were told not to question. That's the whole feeling I got when I was in grade school and catechism classes, that you shouldn't. You're not a nice boy if you question these things, except a little bit.
I think many times that was a reaction of a teacher who wasn't prepared to answer. So at the level of fix-it manuals, we were educated in the seminary, and it was graduate school. You know, most of us were out of college with a bachelor's degree when we started in seminary, and you know, it was how-to manuals that we had instead of a text that would read in paragraphs and chapters about moral principles, ethics, or the teachings of Christ, or something like that. And for example, stealing. When would it become a mortal sin? If the thing that we stole was valued at $100 or more, there was the line. It was $99. It wasn't a mortal sin. It was a venial sin. And it was as cut and dried as that. And that, looking back on it, is silly. That was in the 1950s. But I think that Vatican II tried to mature its priests and its people. And we presumed an awful lot. We thought that they would come along very easily, but you know, the method of educating before that was so superficial that we had kept them as children, and they weren't able to come along, and that caused the great trauma in the church, I think. You know, people are angry. A lot of people are still angry 33 years later that their whole religion had been pulled out from under them. And it's because the religion that they had was on the surface, and it was caught up with a lot of religious practices and not too many ideas in religion or in ethics. And you know, we took all the visibles away from them, and they had nothing left. And that, you know, we took their religion away from them. Some people say that I didn't leave the Catholic Church left me. But Hans Kung was suspended from teaching in Catholic universities, and reprimanded for delving too deeply into the whole subject. And that, you know, that's an example of what we started to talk about today. Getting slapped down if you ask too many questions. And the article pointed out that all through history, including Galileo and people like that, they've been silenced by the church and proven to be right later on. And some of the theologians have been stymied by the church and 50 years later praised, even canonized.
Yeah. But see, that's why it seems like meaningless to say that the church is divinely guided if it's making these mistakes.
Well, divinely guided in spite of itself, in spite of human decisions along the way.
The ongoing religious quest.
Let's see, are there any questions you want to ask me, or I don't know?
Well, not questions.
Observations.
I might think of something. I like the opportunity to talk to someone who has left the church and admits it. There's a great unwashed middle group there that still claim that they're Catholics, but they left for all practical purposes, and you never get to talk to them. Sometimes at a wedding reception, when they're half smashed, they'll talk to you, but they don't really make much sense, and you can tell from what they say that they never really integrated the faith into their lives. It was, just something that they did as an altar boy or a Girl Scout or something like that. But, it's good to talk to an adult who is seriously investigating religion and looking for the truth. And so I appreciate your time.
Yeah, oh, thanks, yeah. Because I appreciate your time. As I mentioned, there are priests who wouldn't want to talk to me, and why should they sit down and listen to my criticisms of Catholicism? I think to see why people do leave the church, to see why people are not Christians.
I'm a critic of Catholicism. I expect to spend my whole life looking into things that bother me.
I found Father Wayne to be a very likable, sensible, decent guy. I really liked him a lot. But I do not think he resolved the issues I brought up. The way I see it, either priests have the power to forgive sins, or they don't. Either the church is divinely guided in its moral pronouncements, or it is not. The belabored qualifications given do not clarify the original statements, but rather contradict them and render them meaningless. But I give Father Wayne a lot of credit because he was willing to talk about the issues.